Let's talk a little bit more about dereferencing, and I want to go a little bit deeper into that concept and give you the larger story, the fuller story. In dereferencing, and I'll refer to the pictures that are on your screen here. What we want to do is we want to go from a reference to the actual item that it's a reference to. And that works in two directions. At the moment, I could be inside the item that has the referent in it. In other words, the item that lists an ID of another item inside of it. Or, interestingly, I can be in the item that's pointed to by some other item in the info base. Either way, I have a link. Either way, there's an association between item A and item B. Item B has no direct indication that there's an association, but the association exists because item A is sitting there pointing to B. So if I have a situation like this, item A over here pointing to B, there's a relationship between A and B, right? They're associated whether B knows it or not, and B doesn't directly know that it's associated, but I can always find the item that's pointing to B. If I'm in B, I find the item that's pointing to me, and that establishes the link. And that's very useful and very interesting because what I don't want to do is I don't want to do this. I don't want to have item B pointing to item A and item A pointing to item B. That's a dangerous situation. It's a non-elegant situation, but it's also a dangerous situation. It's non-elegant because item A might say, I don't point to item B. Item A might point to item C, and item B points to item A. Now, is there a link between those two or not? I have the ability to say the wrong thing. I also don't really need to have both specify the link. If I say, for example, my brother is George, George does not have to say my brother is Bob. Because I've said my brother is George, it implies that George's brother is Bob. That relationship is symmetrical. There's no reason to have any asymmetricality, or there's no reason to specify that relationship on both sides of the link. Furthermore, as I just indicated, that's dangerous because if A is pointing to A is pointing to C and B is pointing to A, what's right? Is there a link between A and B or not? B says there is, A says there isn't. So that's a dangerous situation. So where I want to go here by the end of this little talk is talking about how do I dereference from B as well as from A. So we've done some work already with dereferencing from A to B, A being the one that lists B as an ID. And I just want to go over that again to make sure that it's solid. So here I have an instance and a transform that you can see on your screen. And it says, how do I get from M1 to M2? And we see that M1 and M2 are movies. And so here's our little movie instance. And I happen to be on M1 here. M1 is the current node. And I have a title called The Gambler and lots of other stuff. And then somewhere down the line, I have a related movie ref ID pointing to M2. Okay, so this is a situation you've seen before. I have a reference to item B inside of item A. I have a reference to the color of money inside the gambler. Better stated, I have a reference to M2 inside of M1. Okay, so looking at the transform here, we can see that we do a template match movie. So at some point we've done an apply templates or some other way of matching that movie element. And when we match that movie element, we put out the title inside an H1, all well and good. We do an apply templates to the lots of other stuff, which allows us to, whatever is in lots of other stuff, to process it. We don't have to worry about that in this transform. It's probably not even in this transform. All the templates that process that has probably been included in this transform. So that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the next section that says related movies. So there's a link, there's a relationship between M1 and M2, and we know that it's the ID M2 listed in the item M1 that establishes that link. And so we also see from this transform that there can be more than one. If there, well, we don't necessarily see that, but when we see for each select related movie ref ID, it's a fair assumption that I can have more than one related movie, and it's a fair assumption that it's a for each because it can be an unbounded list, and I want to create a link for each movie in here. Okay, so notice that that for each starting on line 18 is wrapped inside a UL because I'm going to use a bullet list, and I want the definition of the bullet list outside the for each, and I only want to present the for each, I only want to, for each reference I want to put in an LI. I don't want to put in a UL for each reference, so I leave the UL outside of the for each loop. Okay, so the first thing I do is establish a variable. I don't absolutely have to establish a variable. I could use that current object or the current function, but in this case I'm going to use the variable because it's simpler. Okay, so I put in the variable ref ID, I select the value of the related movie ref ID, so when I get to line 22, I have a variable called ref ID and its value is what? Think about it, M2, right? M2 is what's in that variable by the time I get to line 22. So now I do what we've seen done before, the href, and I'm making a very simple href here. I'm just saying whatever the ID, there's going to be an m2.htm out there in the world, and so all I have to do in order to make a link, an href kind of link, an HTML link to that movie, is to create a URL, and that URL is going to be m2.htm. So very simple, straightforward. I don't want to focus on making a link right now. I want to focus on the dereferencing operation. And so I say the href, the referent is whack whack movie, where ID equals ref ID. So this is should be starting to be very familiar code. I'm selecting the movie whose ID is ref ID, so that's the dereferencer. That's the point at which I move from the reference to the item that's being referenced. And then I tack on the string .htm simply to form an HTML page out of it. Okay, and then on line 24, I say XSL select value of, again, the dereferencer, whack whack movie, where ID equals ref ID, and this time I select the title. And that's it, that's a link. The link needs the title for the hot text, or it uses the title for the hot text, and it uses the ID to form the HTML href. Okay, so that's example one. That's the one we've gone over before, so this is kind of by way of review. But now let's do one that's a little bit more interesting, and we haven't seen before, and that's getting from M2 back to M1. Now we're not on the gambler, we're not on M1, we're on M2. And notice M2 does not have any related movie ref IDs. Does that mean it's not related to any other movies? No, that means that inside of the M2 movie, we don't have any visible links. But we can see, obviously, because we see the whole instance here, that there is a link between M1 and M2. It's just not represented inside of M2. So how do we get back to that? We're going to dereference in the opposite direction. And when we finally get to that piece of code, you'll see it's not that hard. It's not really anything that you can't easily figure out. So let's look at the transform, and most of this is exactly what we've already seen before, but we've added an extra piece to it. So now if we're on an item that has a link that's not exposed inside that item, we can still find it. So let's see what's happening here. We do the same template match movie, we do the same H1 putting in the title of the movie. This time we're going to assume that we're on M2, so instead of putting in the gambler on that line, and I wish I'd put the line numbers here, but I forgot to do that. Instead of putting in the gambler as the movie, now we're on the color of money. And then we put in an H2 and it says related movies. And now look at the UL. The UL is bracketing two different for each loops. The first for each loop is doing forward dereferencing. It's the one we just looked at. It's exactly the same code that we just looked at. The second for each loop is doing backwards dereferencing. It's finding all the items that point to me. So let's jump down to that second for each loop, and right above it you see that we establish a variable. And the variable is called myID, and myID in this case is myID M1 or M2? If this could be a great test question, but I'm not going to make it a test question. I'm just going to have you think about it. In this transform, if we're on movie M2 and we say select at ID, what's our current node? Our current node, because I've told you that, is movie M2. So when I say myID, what goes in there is M2. So we have M2 now, and now we do the for each loop, finding all of the references, all of the items, all of the movies that point to M2. So how do we do that? Whack whack movie, right? We're looking for movies where it has a child called related movie ref ID that has a value equal to my ID. In other words, in plain English, all the movies that point to me, all the movies that have my ID inside of a related movie ref ID. That's going back the other way. It's dereferencing from the movie that doesn't have the reference back to the movie that does have the reference.